Hello everybody and welcome to this amazing game of Barony. In this video I kind of wanted to break away just a little bit from my usual in-depth guides and do something a little more fun. I've seen a lot of questions about each class and how they work, how strong they are, etc. So in an effort to clear some confusion, I figured a tier list might be a good place to start. And just a small disclaimer, these are my opinions and while I think they have some weight to them, some information might be a little biased. I have over 350 hours of Barony, and while I may not be considered an expert by any means, I've played each class several times, so I'm quite familiar with most of them, if not all of them. Additionally, the information I'm sharing is only about the class itself, not the race. That might be another video another time, but I just wanted to mention that. And right before we begin, I just want to take a brief second to explain the tiers. And why I place certain classes in those tiers. So obviously you'll notice I have an OP tier all the way through D tier. OP tier is basically the classes that do their job remarkably. They either have way too much utility or they have all of their points placed in one skill, making it really hard for other classes to compete with them. A tier are what describes classes that are very good at their job, although they have like one or two disadvantages that make the class very strong, but are just held back slightly. These are generally speaking more fun, more threatening, and more safe classes to choose. B tier describes classes that are what I could describe as being maybe a little bit too balanced. They're good, but they're not great. And they're bad, but they're not that bad. Nothing about these classes are remarkable, but again, nothing about them are terrible. Other classes may just simply be better. In C tier are classes that are either too risky to play, they're either not strong enough, or they're just too unreliable to play. And while they can be very fun to play, it ultimately boils down to them being just kind of underwhelming, or again, just the fact that other classes can do their job better. And last is D tier, which in my opinion, these classes are just too underwhelming to play. They're still super fun at times, but they just perform noticeably worse than other classes. And with that out of the way, I really hope you enjoy this video. It's taken a very long time to make. And I know it's going to be quite long. I think it's probably going to be around like 30 to 35 minutes. So everyone's brain at this point is pretty much fucking fried and brain rotted from TikTok and YouTube shorts. So I understand if your attention span isn't too long. Trust me, mine isn't either. So, anywho, timestamps are always in the description. If you just want to click down there and, skip through certain parts of the video, I won't take it personally. But yeah, I really hope you enjoy. The Accursed, I would happily put in A tier. This class is easily one of the strongest classes in the game. The only thing that prevents the Accursed from being in the OP tier is the constant need for blood and a DPS spell. That being said, the Accursed has the potential to deal a ludicrous amount of damage, starting off with a base level of 70 in magic, 40 in casting, stealth, and unarmed, as well as 20 in appraisal. What this means is that this class thrives in magic DPS and quite frankly just outclasses most mages in the game in terms of DPS potential. The only problems with this class are two things: no DPS spell to start out with, and notoriously, the constant hunger drain. In fact, it's so bad that you can actually burn through like 4 or 5 vials of blood in just about 2 to 3 minutes, which is nuts. Starving to death is just as common as having your pixelated bun smacked down by a skeleton. Additionally, the lack of DPS spells in the early game can very quickly determine whether or not you'll make it to the next level. But again, once you find them, this class pops off insanely fast. In fact, most speedrunners prefer this class, of course paired with another race, to absolutely fly through levels in record time. Aside from those two glaring issues, the Accursed is absolutely one of the best classes in the entire game. It's a very high risk, high reward playstyle. The Arcanist is one of the most versatile ranged classes in Barony, and definitely deserves to be in the A tier as well. It's a really nice mix of magic and range damage, suitable for most situations you find yourself in. When fighting an enemy with a high magic resistance, you just simply swap to your bow. and vice versa depending on the enemy. In my opinion, this class is perhaps one of the most noob-friendly classes, as, well, again, you can really just swap your playstyle around at any point. If you can't seem to find any decent spells, range damage will easily carry you through the game. And same thing if you can't find any good bows. Although I tend to just use spells, and when my mana is regenerating, I just swap to bows. Anywho, it is a very cookie cutter class, but also a very effective class. And the best approach for leveling up is, without a doubt, saving your fireball staff for the gnomish mines, and using it to kill any wizard gnomes, the ones with the lightning staff. Simply kill one and you'll be able to kill the rest. In most cases, you can end up leaving the gnomish mines with like 4 to 6 lightning staffs, which is crazy. The Arcanist is very deserving to be on the A tier. And the Barbarian. It's an extremely mediocre class for pretty much every player. The Barbarian offers a very straightforward melee playstyle revolving around axes and maces. It's not exactly beginner friendly, nor is it really preferred by any experienced player, and I feel like it's because it's not even exactly balanced. It's just a mediocre class. I mean, you do start out with 50 in axes, which is decent, but you randomly have 25 points assigned in swimming, as well as 10 in alchemy. You won't have to worry about swimming until you make it past the first stage, which, again, frankly, extra points in alchemy can increase healing from potions, but I mean, when you think of a barbarian, a warmongering soldier built for hand-to-hand combat, trained to rip flesh off of living humans, when you think of that, do you think of the same person going home after eating human flesh just to decide to pick up potion mixing as a Pinterest hobby? It just doesn't really make sense. I'd rather have that extra 10 points in blocking. Shit, put those points into something that the class will actually use, instead of like 5 extra points in healing. You could argue that the Barbarian would tear through the swamp because of the increased swimming stats and the goblins being weak to axes, but it's just a boring argument, really. This class is about as useful as the Minotaur's gooch. Next. The Brewer is a class designed for masochists and nerds. Personally, I find potion mixing incredibly boring. It's either too difficult to remember, or it's just not very effective. Frankly, I don't really care to write down graphs and formulas just to create a potion of invisibility to sneak around enemies, but I will say that people who dedicate their time to figuring out how to craft specific potions are the true homies. I would happily put this in A tier, but I love these kinds of people. I mean, you know how awesome it is to play a game like Terraria, and playing with that friend that builds potion farms, and right before you guys fight a boss, he's like, "Bro, come here, I got a few potions for you." And then he gives you like 11 different potions specifically tailored to that boss. I love those people. Anyways, this class has insane potential. Insane potential for anyone who enjoys that kind of playstyle, but I think for the majority of players, we all just want to cast 6 spells and whack shit to death. It's a really fun concept, and the 6 people who play this class can absolutely annihilate floors with their lightning storm and potion and fireball potions, but it takes a long time to get to that point. Additionally, the micromanagement of different types of potions, empty bottles, bottles of water, the alembic, teammates using fountains, forgetting you need to bottle the water. It can be pretty overwhelming, and honestly, it's kind of frustrating. It's a really fun concept, and to those players who play this class just nonchalant, you guys are the true MVPs. I would happily put this in A tier, most certainly. The Cleric is to me one of the best classes in the game for beginners, and frankly is just an extremely reliable class for most people. It's a beautiful blend of magic and melee that makes this class so rigid for anyone interested in a very strong melee class early game, and then transitions into more of a spellcasting carry. Additionally, you always spawn with a blessed mace and some defensive equipment, as well as a spellbook of Troll's Blood, increasing health regen of you and those around you. It's such an effective approach for most players as they have the means to dominate the early game thanks to most enemies being extremely vulnerable to maces, and then you safely search around for loot, eventually finding a couple of spellbooks to boost your magic and casting levels, effectively pivoting into a magic carry. This is usually the class I recommend for newer players because it allows you to have such a really strong foundation for a perfect run. It's simple, it's safe, and it's extremely reliable to play. I wouldn't call this class OP because it doesn't really have any skill points funneled into one skill like the Accursed does, but in my opinion this class is the most fine-tuned in terms of balanced. Nothing says OP, but nothing says it's weak. It's very strong, but not strong enough to fly through levels without worry. It's safe enough to take some extra damage, but also it's not safe enough to ignore enemies entirely. Honestly, I couldn't recommend this class enough. I would happily place this in I think an A tier. And I promise there's going to be more variety. It's not all classes are going to be an A tier. So anyways, moving on. The next class is the healer, and I think this is going to be the most controversial opinion in this entire video. I would honestly put it at like high C tier, only because it really only has like 3 things going for it. It's a superb support class when playing with friends. Obviously the heal and the status effect removal is very nice, and the decent levels in magic casting. Aside from that, it's extremely squishy. It has almost no DPS potential unless you find a decent spellbook early on. But quite honestly, this class is outstanding at being subpar. Fun fact, my first solo win was with the healer. And let me tell you, it took a ridiculous amount of patience and determination. It just became unnecessarily stressful the entire playthrough, although I will admit that it is nice to heal pretty much whenever you want. But once you get the footing of Barony, you learn how to approach situations differently and generally just take less damage, lowering the need for heals to begin with. I don't fully recommend this class unless you're playing with friends. I understand it's a support role, but it's so enveloped by its role that it can make it kind of boring. It's decent at best. Other classes like the Wizard, the Accursed, the Conjurer, the Arcanist, the Mesmer, the Cleric, hell, even the Shaman can outclass the healer the moment they find a spellbook of healing. It's simply the matter of this class is alright, but others can do its job so much better. I think it's worthy of being on the border of like low B and high C tier. The Hunter is a class that's very similar to the Rogue, but it's more focused on range damage. Starting with the magic boomerang, you always have a really good source of DPS regardless of which stage you're on. In fact, the boomerang pierces 25% of the target's armor when hit, packing quite a punch. It always comes back, and you never have to worry about it degrading. And this isn't even mentioning the bow you start out with, along with the different types of ammo to take the ideal approach to dangerous enemies. The Hunter struggles with being extremely squishy, starting at only 20 hit points. I find myself dying extremely often when I play this class, but with enough experience, the Hunter can be very effective, assuming they can avoid taking too much damage. It can take a crazy amount of patience depending on what kind of player you are, so due to how dangerous it is to play the Hunter, I would comfortably place it in like a low A to a high B tier. I would probably put it on high B tier. Next up we have the Conjurer, which 100% is in the OP tier. In my over 300 hours of playing Barony, I have yet to see a single Conjurer be useless. It pairs very well with the skeleton race, however, the Conjurer itself is easily, and I mean easily, one of, if not the most reliably safe and effective DPS classes in the game. You might say, why? It just spawns skeletons, it doesn't do anything else. And true, but the skeletons are just the bread. You know what pairs well with bread? Lots of things. Butter, jelly, soup, cheese, turkey. You get the point. Coupled with the bread, aka the skeletons, this class has very high skill points in leadership, magic, and casting, as well as a decent level of, I think it's 20 in range. But do you see where I'm going with this? It's a perfect sandwich. Maybe not in that order, that would be kind of gross. But this isn't even mentioning how your skeleton minions can evolve at different levels, gaining new equipment like swords and pole arms and armor, and the fact that you can eventually spawn multiple skeletons. I mean, if that's not enough, just think about basically having two mini tanks, both absorbing and dealing moderate damage per second, while you're supporting them with healing and DPS spells. It's insane. I've played this class about a dozen times, and I've beaten the final boss probably a dozen times. It's one of the easiest classes to play, and I mean, you just spawn a bunch of skeletons and they do the dirty work for you. I will say that if you're not constantly spawning skeletons and leveling them up, then this class isn't the absolute best, but it still has alternatives like magic and ranged. I think I've said enough. The Conjurer is perhaps the most overpowered class in the game. I would happily put this in high OP tier. The Joker is ironically a really fun class to play, although it's definitely not the best. Some would say that the Joker is really strong, starting out with a Ring of Levitation and a Spell of Confusion, but that's really all this class has going for it. You can try to utilize the extra magic and range levels, but you have to find those weapons first. The Joker doesn't start out with any reliable weapons, it just starts with a slingshot and a couple of rocks, but these are more of a measly excuse for range damage. And as I mentioned previously, floating around is super useful, pretty much letting you ignore any pits and eventually water and lava. And sure, you can levitate with the ring, but honestly, finding rings of levitation, or like any means of levitation, is not that hard, especially later on in the game. You ultimately find yourself getting a sick ass ring and a very slow and unreliable early game. Other classes have better ranged weapons, cast crazy spells, or sneak around assassinating enemies. It's fun to play with friends to see how good you are, but on its own, it's pretty difficult to play. I would put this probably right below the Barbarian. The Mechanist, I don't think there's any discussion for this. Easily one of the best classes for any player, but specifically experienced players. It takes a different approach in your runs, but it adds up to a perfect approach to most encounters in Barony. You can open locked doors and chests with lockpicks, bait dangerous enemies in traps, or even bunker down with a few sentry turrets. This is only a handful of the options the Mechanist can utilize thanks to the Tinkering Kit. While you do need scrap to craft items, you can collect a bunch of torches and just get a crazy amount of scrap from that. If you know your way around each stage, the Mechanist can make very quick work of each enemy. You won't really struggle too much, so I'll gladly place the Mechanist in probably like mid to low OP tier, only because it's a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult than the other OP classes. The Merchant is another mediocre class. It starts out with a very high appraisal and trading skill and, well, not much else. This class can solve other classes' issues, but with identifying items, it allows you to watch out for cursed items, but that's really it. Sure, you'll eventually start selling things for a bunch of gold, but way later in the game, gold is pretty easy to gather. I could describe it as a unique playstyle, selling things to buy strong items, but that about sums up the class. I get the excitement of finding a really solid weapon or a spellbook in the shop, maybe even buying a bunch of stuff for your friends, but that's about it. It's not outstandingly strong in DPS or defense, but it makes up for the extra utility and trading, so I guess that's alright. This might be a hot take, and I completely get it. I would put the Mesmer in D tier. I personally really enjoy playing the Mesmer class, but For anyone who's played it more than like twice, I'm sure you'll agree that it's one of the most underwhelming classes in the game, and that's kind of sad. Sure, you start out with a charming staff and decent magic stats, but that's really about it. This class struggles heavily with the lack of health, although it makes up for the high damage potential. Coupled with the slow spell and the 60 points in leadership, the Mesmer appears to be very strong, however it almost always falls short. Mistakes are often unforgiven, and as I just mentioned, the lack of health makes the early game very stressful. Like most classes, once you get the ball rolling, the Mesmer will ramp up very quickly. I have a ton of fun playing the Mesmer, but unfortunately it's just not a very good class. You rely on finding followers and charming strong monsters to use as a meat shield, but once that staff breaks, you're kinda just shit out of luck. I would love to start out with like a lesser charm monster spell instead of the staff and the actual charm monster spell book. Maybe something that just charms a monster for like 60 seconds or something. I'm not sure. I mean, it would still consume mana, so you're not like constantly charming enemies, and that would kind of be overpowered. But I'm not sure. It just kind of sucks that other classes can fully invest in their role, like the Shaman or the Wizard or the Mechanist. And they have a truly unique approach with their playstyle. You'd think the Mesmer would run around floors using charmed monsters to do the dirty work, but instead you get like a great value knockoff version of that. Again, I love the Mesmer, but it just unfortunately deserves to be in like D tier. The Monk. Not much to say about this class, although it's a super strong class. It's primarily focused around the unarmed skill. In fact, you could argue that the Monk should only ever use the fist to deal out damage, and honestly you'd be right. Most enemies in Barony have almost no damage resistance against unarmed attacks, or take increased damage, making the Monk an extremely effective class to play. You either find yourself running straight into enemies and killing them in just a few hits. I wouldn't exactly call the Monk OP by any means, but it checks so many boxes in terms of how enjoyable this class is. It's fun, it's unique, not to mention how deceptively strong it is. Overall, I think the Monk deserves to be in a high A tier, probably right above. I would probably say like mid A tier actually. I might be a little biased with the Ninja, but I truly believe this class is outstandingly strong. This is also my favorite class to play, so I mean, I might be just a little biased. You're primarily focused in dealing extremely high melee damage to unsuspecting enemies, but you can also instead play safer while using throwable weapons, which, if you're not familiar with them, are probably the most broken weapon type in Barony. I don't think they're balanced by any means, honestly. They never break, they pierce armor, and you can stack up to 9 of each type. As long as you're picking them back up and plan a very minimal strategy against enemies, these things will carry you through the entire game, seriously. They're ridiculously strong. If you instead decide to commit to being more of a melee assassin, you'll be pleasantly surprised with the absurd amount of damage you can dish out. In fact, if you're using a weapon the enemy is weak to, you can easily kill them in 1 to 2 hits, as long as you're sneaking up on them. If you manage to find the Durnwin from what everyone keeps correcting me on, Shelob, but I keep saying Shelob. Guys, it's Shelob. I don't care what you say, it's Shelob. Anywho, if you find the Durnwin, you can consider that run an easy win. It's a sword that deals a ludicrous amount of damage and never breaks. Yes, the fuck, sir. I don't ever find myself struggling too much when playing as the Ninja. I mean, the entire playstyle revolves around assassinating enemies and sneaking around, so you're always safe and will almost always be the carry, so to speak. And next we have the Rogue, which is pretty similar to the Ninja and the Hunter, although it focuses a bit more on the tinkering skill. You start out with a few lockpicks and subpar equipment, but unfortunately no tinkering kit. So while you start out with 50 points in the tinkering skill, you don't really get to utilize it until you find a tinkering kit. I mean, if you enjoy the aspect of sneaking around and the idea of stealing arrows out of arrow traps, this class is okay. I think the issue is that other classes can do its job a little bit better. I mean, the Mechanist starts out with a tinkering kit just from the start of the game, and the Ninja just exerts so much more damage. Additionally, the Hunter may be a bit squishier, but it starts out with the same stats and offers a little bit more flexibility with your playstyle. So in hindsight, you may consider playing a different class. It's certainly not the worst, but overall, there's not a lot of people who play the Rogue and say, damn, this class is super unique and fun. I'd be happy with placing it in like a low B tier, high C tier. The Sexton. The Sexton is a really similar class to the Cleric. I'm honestly a little bit surprised with how similar they are, but I mean, it offers a little bit more flexibility with the skills. The main difference is that you have a slight increase in magic and casting skills, and about 40 points in stealth. Additionally, you start out with more utility-based spells, including a spell of locking, opening, and sleep, all of which are fairly niche. Never in 300 hours of playing Barony have I unironically used the locking spell. It's just boring and extremely niche to use. Anyways, the Sexton is more of a utility-based spellcasting class, and that's about it. It performs just as well as other B tiers, and I think that's a worthy spot for this class. Next up we have the Shaman, which is absolutely one of the most unique classes in Barony by a long shot. It's by far one of the most enjoyable classes thanks to the shape-shifting playstyle. I mean, you're able to play as a different monster type and gain access to incredible abilities. This class really has it all, although it can struggle slightly in the early game. But if you can recruit a bunch of rats and avoid taking too much damage, the Shaman can be insanely fun. It's one of the most versatile classes in the game. Honestly, I think the devs did an outstanding job at making it stand out. Once you get to the late game, the Shaman does a superb job at keeping up with other classes, and it deals a ton of damage. It's able to absorb and heal any damage taken, and it provides you and your team with a crazy amount of utility. You can locate food when you find yourself in a pinch, you can break walls without a pickaxe, and you can even float above pits and lava. All of that, and depending on what monster you shapeshift into, you can recruit that monster type along with any allies to that monster. Seriously, this class is more than worthy of being in high A tier just because of how fun it is to play. The Wanderer, another average class in my opinion, although it's one of the better classes for beginners. You start out with a few pieces of equipment that gives you a pretty strong foundation for your run. You can see monsters on your minimap, reveal the entire dungeon floor 6 times with the scrolls, and you also start out with a ton of food, avoiding starving to death. And last but most certainly not least, you start with a spell that reveals the location of food on your minimap. Honestly, like, what else do you need? This class falls short slightly in terms of DPS potential, but that's not really where it's supposed to shine. It simply solves many of the early to mid-game issues with exploring, with 25 points in polearms and range damage to help you maintain your distance against enemies. Honestly, it's a perfect balance between survivability and utility. But if you ever find yourself struggling with the early game, I couldn't recommend this class more. I would be comfortable with placing it at like a high B tier range. And next up we have the Wizard, and oh boy, honestly this class easily high A tier, 100%. It's almost in the OP category. It's really hard not to put it there. The only thing that holds this class back from being in the OP tier is the lack of defense and the dangerous enemies later in the game. You start out with very strong spells that many classes simply struggle finding, and the cherry on top is the 50 points in magic and casting, ultimately making the Wizard a massive threat against most enemies. Although the wizard can push out uncontested DPS, it can be problematic the later you are in the game. More enemies spawn with magic reflection capes, or just have a crazy high amount of damage or magic damage resistance, putting a screeching halt to your rampage. Coupled with the low amount of defense, you'll likely find yourself in a pinch quite often. In my opinion, this class is superb at dealing incredibly high DPS, even rivaling the Accursed in some situations. If it started with more defense, this class would easily be in the overpowered tier. But that being said, A tier is the wizard's home. The Punisher is another underwhelming class. The abilities are sick 100%, but the mana costs prevent you from using them too often. The whip is great at disarming your enemies and briefly stunning them, but you kinda have to go out of your way to utilize that mechanic. While the other classes have a bunch of base stats leveled up, the Punisher only starts with 4 stats, and none of them make the Punisher very strong. Along with the shitty stats, the Punisher has very little health, forcing you to play very cautiously. It almost screams niche and gimmicky. Not only that, but getting to the point where you can comfortably navigate each stage is pretty difficult. In the right hands, the Punisher can do very well, although the spells are super unique and fun to use, but the class ultimately feels like it falls short in many ways. I feel bad for giving it a C tier, but quite honestly, it's just not a very strong class overall. And last, we have the Warrior. This was the first class I ever played in Barony, and although I died many times, I thought it was a solid class, and in hindsight, I think I was right. You start out with a ton of defense, allowing for a more risky but safer playstyle. Taking damage is very manageable, and it's really never too punishing. Paired with the very high polearm stats, the Warrior thrives in beating down enemies safely. The Warrior also excels in recruiting allies, allowing you to lead your own little army into battle. Kinda like how other classes excel in their roles, like the Ninja or the Mechanist, the Warrior will often stick to a more tanky playstyle. It struggles a bit with being pretty slow, but in my opinion, it really struggles with the difficulty in learning spells, which I know is a weird point, but it's very hard to level up magic and casting when you have 0 points in those skills, effectively making the Warrior a very straightforward class to play in terms of versatility. You tank hits, you whack shit to death, and you can recruit a bunch of allies. That's about it. I would put it in right above the Rogue, I think. And B tier is more like average. There's nothing crazy about them, but there's also nothing crazy bad about them. And that about wraps up this video. I feel happy with the tier list overall. I feel like most people would agree with certain classes being placed in certain tiers. You know, something like the Conjurer being OP and the Mesmer not being strong really whatsoever. I feel like most people would agree, but after all, it is my tier list. There's going to be a little bit of bias in it. But if you have any opinions that differ from mine, if you have any feedback, definitely leave a comment below. I really love reading your guys' comments. Sometimes when I experience a little bit of burnout, there's nothing that motivates me more than seeing, you know, all these kind words in the comments. Even just letting me know how your experience with Barony is going. It's just, I don't know. I can't help but to feel like, I don't know, almost included in some of those memories and some of your opinions. It's just, I don't know. I'm breaking away from the script just a little bit. It's just a lot of fun interacting with you guys. So that being said, yeah, I greatly appreciate you for watching. If you have any recommendations, any feedback, please feel free to leave a comment, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.